Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon, at least where I am. My name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and this is the Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology webinar. We are Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. We provide assistance to doctoral students from the beginning of the process, topic development, all the way through to the final dissertation defense. We have qualitative and quantitative and research mentors on staff who are here to provide assistance to doctoral students like yourself. You will be receiving a copy of this slideshow, this webinar slide deck tomorrow, by tomorrow. So if you come in late at all, you will be able to access that. I will also leave some time at the end so that you can ask any questions and we can get those covered. I will also have Janine in the background just in case of any technical difficulties during the webinar, and she can field any questions about the services that we can provide. Again, if there are questions related to the content of the webinar and qualitative methods, we'll leave time at the end to answer those. So you can see our contact information here. This will be presented throughout the webinar, and you'll see this again at the end. So again, this webinar is related specifically to the qualitative methods chapter and really focuses on what needs to be included in that chapter. So this slide presents the major sections of each chapter. This webinar will include kind of a high-level overview of what goes into these sections. So this is both the outline for the presentation today, as well as your outline for your chapter. So beginning with an introduction, moving on to research design and the rationale for the design, the role of the researcher, the methodology, the issues of trustworthiness, and the summary. So if you don't have a template or a checklist from your school, you don't really know where to start, I think this webinar will be very, very helpful for you. As always, defer to your school. Okay, so this is a compilation of what I have seen working with students over the years of what is most typically found in a qualitative methods chapter, but your school might be a little bit different. So definitely follow what your school and what your chair wants. In the introduction to the chapter, as with your other introductions, in your other chapters, you want to restate the purpose of the study. You will do this verbatim. It needs to appear exactly the same everywhere you see it throughout your dissertation. So you can literally copy and paste from your first chapter, your introduction chapter, into the intro section of your methods chapter. Okay, that can start to feel redundant after a while. I absolutely understand that. The problem is that even words that are very closely related to each other can change the meaning. And we don't want to do that at this stage because that has implications and it can kind of snowball out of control from there because it can change the meaning of what you're doing. So word for word, exactly the same, write the purpose in the introduction. And then also in the introduction, you want to preview each of the main sections of the chapter. So just the high points, here's what's coming up. And I always like to think about this in terms of you look backward and you look forward. Okay, so the introduction, you're orienting the reader, right? So reintroduce the purpose of the study, what's it all about? And then in that way, you're showing them, you're leaning back into what has already come before, and then you're presenting a highlight, a preview of the sections of the chapter. Okay, so lean back, lean forward. So think about that as you're writing. And then also, I like to think too about kind of holding the reader's hand. It shouldn't be a guessing game. Everything should just be laid out very clearly and logically. So imagine as you're working on this that you are the reader and what makes the most sense in terms of presentation. That'll help you stay oriented. So in the research design section, we'll spend a little time on this in the webinar today. You want to restate the research questions. So these probably appeared in your introduction chapter. And again, this is a place where they are stated exactly the same way that they were in your intro chapter. Okay, don't change any of the language verbatim, exactly the same. Okay, you want to present whatever it is that you are studying. If it's a phenomenon that you're studying, if it's a case, a concept, identify what that is, and then you want to define that for the reader. Okay, so to get them oriented to the study, whatever it is you're studying, identify and define that. You also want to identify what kind of approach or tradition you're using. And of course, in this case, I'm going to assume that perhaps you're interested in a qualitative study because you're in a qualitative methods webinar. But there are other approaches, quantitative or mixed methods, where you combine elements of both qualitative and quantitative. So in this section, you will identify whatever that approach or tradition is, and then you'll also identify the research design. So there are, within qualitative approaches, there are a lot of different qualitative designs that you might take on. So it could be a case study, it could be a phenomenological study, it could be any number of other qualitative designs. What you want to do in this section is demonstrate that you are familiar with and have a good working knowledge of why qualitative studies are helpful when they are used, when they're most appropriate. But you also want to do that for quantitative studies and for mixed method studies. By laying this all out, then you demonstrate that you're familiar with all of them, so you can really justify why a qualitative approach is the best fit, the most appropriate for your own study. Okay, you'll do the same thing with the design. So you may have selected a phenomenological study, a phenomenological design, but you want to show that you are familiar with other possible options, because that's how you build the case. That's how you justify that for your research questions and for the purpose of your research, why a phenomenological design is the most appropriate. So I like to think of this in two sections. You spend one section outlining qualitative, what's it good for? Quantitative, what's it good for? Mixed methods, what's it good for? And then you do the same thing for the design, okay? And really drive home then which one you selected and why. So why select a qualitative design then? Okay, qualitative designs are really helpful when we have textual data. Okay, so when your research questions and when the purpose of your research has to do with understanding perspectives and experiences of people, those are kind of key words that a qualitative study might be the best approach. Okay, data collection for qualitative research usually includes interviews, focus groups, documents, observations. So think like lots of text as opposed to numbers. Okay. The goal with qualitative studies is not necessarily to be able to generalize findings to a larger population. Okay, so that makes it a little bit different from quantitative in some ways. We don't test hypotheses in qualitative research. We have our research questions outlined, and we try to address those research questions through data collection and analysis. And we're not quantifying our results in qualitative studies. So I'll touch on each of these in turn, but a lot of times I work with students who are using case studies, phenomenological studies, or generic or kind of a more generalized approach to qualitative research. Occasionally, I do work with students who are conducting grounded theory studies or ethnographies, although those are less common in the students I work with. But I'll touch on each of them and sort of just provide a little overview of when they might be appropriate. So a case study is really helpful when you are looking at a specific example of something, a case, right, over time, and it's a really in-depth analysis. Okay, so I like to think of a case study as, you are looking at something, you are drilling deep, deep down into it, and you're looking at it from all different angles. Okay, so within the case study design, you might have a multiple case study. And so if that's true, then those cases would be related in somehow. They would be bound by some uniting factor. And so it might be that you are exploring an atypical case of something. So maybe you are interested in a new, let's see, high school math curriculum, okay? And in a school district, 6 schools have implemented this new curriculum, okay? And 5 of those schools have seen improvements in student outcomes after the implementation. But one of the, there hasn't been a change. So that's, an atypical case. Something's going on there and you want to find out what that is. So you might use multiple data collection methods in order to gather data, again, from all angles, right, to understand what's happening here. So you might conduct interviews with teachers and administrators, or if there are, instructional design people or coaches at the school, you might conduct interviews with them. You may collect documents like lesson plans, right, related to the new curriculum, and maybe take a look at some of the old curriculum as well. You might observe the classroom to see what students are doing in the classroom when this curriculum is implemented. Okay, so this provides this really, 360 look at what that case is. And so the goal then is to generate this, deep description of the case and take a look at the themes or the patterns that emerge from the study of that case to really drill down and understand what's going on there. Phenomenological studies are a little bit different. They are really heavily rooted in philosophy for one, and then also psychology, which kind of makes sense because they're really helpful for exploring what we call the lived experience of participants. So someone who has been through something, okay, this phenomenon, and the way that they make meaning and assign meaning to that experience, okay? And so unlike with case studies, phenomenological studies are really conducted through in-depth interviews. And this might be more than one interview with each participant. Interviews may be several hours in length, because here you're drilling into the psychology of what it's like to have been through that experience, okay? And so the goal then is there's sort of this, underpinning philosophical assumption that there's commonality to that experience, that there's sort of a structure in there. And that's what the phenomenological approach can help uncover. So illuminating that structure, that essence that is common amongst people who have been through that phenomenon. Okay, so a little bit different, in approach, and then also in the methods associated with it. Generic or more general qualitative approaches are really helpful for when your study doesn't quite fit into another design. So maybe it's not exactly a case study, but maybe it's not exactly an ethnography or a grounded theory study. If it doesn't, if you determine, and again, I really want to drive home that your purpose and your research questions are what drive your design. So it's not that you are simply selecting an approach kind of out of thin air, right? It has to make sense in the context of your study. But if it makes sense that a case study isn't quite appropriate or a phenomenological study isn't quite appropriate, then it's possible that a generic approach is. I do sometimes hear from students that their committee members or chairs believe that this is not a defensible design, and it absolutely is. Okay. And if you are someone struggling with this, I recommend the Percy and colleagues. I realize that 2015 is slightly out of date at this point, but this reference that I have here at the end, they have a really great piece on how to justify a generic design. Okay, so if you're struggling to do that, then I recommend checking that out. So this might be the case where, you know, you're interested in the experience, but you're not interested in like the psychology, the meaning making associated with the experience. You might just want to know what, you know, just sort of a general description of an experience. Okay, so a generic qualitative design might be really helpful there. It could be part of a mixed methods study as well. And so for generic qualitative designs, you can use interviews, you can use observations, documents, questionnaires, written oral surveys. And I present this like it's a buffet, but we're not talking about a free-for-all buffet. Okay, it just means that you have options because the design is flexible for you to decide which are the most appropriate methods for your study. So the goal then here, and what this should yield, is an understanding or a description of the outer world content, right? Not the inward focus, not the meaning making, but just the outer world description of the experience. As I said, I don't see grounded theory studies quite as often as the three that I've just mentioned. Grounded theory is quite different because the starting point is in the unknown. So when there is very little known about a topic, you know, instead of beginning with research questions, you begin by interviewing people. And so you interview, you conduct field work. Again, you may decide that some kind of text and document analysis is helpful. There's a lot of memoing and writing that happens, theoretical saturation, where you reach a point where you're not learning anything new. But grounded theory, the data collection and the data analysis proceed at the same time. It's this iterative approach where, and kind of back and forth, where you collect some data, you analyze it, and based on the analysis, then you sort of start to formulate more questions, and then you collect more data, you find new participants, and this goes on and on and on until you reach that theoretical saturation point. And so the goal of grounded theory then is, you might guess, is you don't start with the theoretical framework. Okay, the idea is that you are generating new theory or model that is grounded in your data. Okay, so the starting point isn't theory. That's not what's driving your study. That's the goal. So producing a broad explanation of whatever that concept is, process, action, or interaction that you're studying, right? That's ultimately the goal. Ethnographic studies are also, you know, as I said, I don't see them quite as much. They're really rooted in the social sciences. They are very helpful for understanding a problem in a much broader cultural or societal context. So these are really holistic inquiries as well. In this case, you're looking at networks of people or institutions, social groupings. Okay, so it has to do more with society and culture, and how whatever the concept is that you're studying sort of takes place within that setting. So ethnographers use interviews, they use observations and conversations. They also use field work, so going oftentimes somewhere else, maybe a different country, to conduct participant observation, which is where you're not just observing what it's like in this other place, but you're immersing yourself in it. You're participating in daily life along with others. And so the idea here is that you're producing this in-depth account, what we call an ethnography, of the research problem that is, from the perspective of participants, because you've conducted this field work. And so the idea is that you have some understanding of what it's like to be them, and then placing that in the cultural context. So that's the research design section. And just, like I said, to give you an idea of some possible designs that you might start thinking about for your own studies. You will include a section on the role of the researcher. So are you an observer? Are you a participant? As I just, explained with ethnography, are you both? Are you a participant observer? What is your role here? Okay. And this is really important because we all bring certain biases to our research. That is inevitable. And what we need to do then is be able to reflect on those, to identify those potential areas of bias and describe how we plan to mitigate them. Okay. So are there potential conflicts of interest that exist between you and your participants, or power dynamics, ethical issues related to your study? For example, if you're conducting, if we go back to that classroom case study, do you work in that school district? Are you a principal, right? So you have, there's a power dynamic between you and the teachers that would have to be mitigated. So you want to think through as much as you can ahead of time, so that you can address what these potential areas of bias or ethical issues are and how you plan to handle those. In your methodology section, you will include, there are a couple of things, and I recommend sort of separating this out. So having a subheading for participants. So you'll describe the overall population. So what is the group of people from which you will draw the sample? That's all the people that could potentially be included in your study. So obviously you're not going to include every single person. You're going to have to sample from that. So what is that larger population? What is your sampling strategy? And in qualitative research, purposive or purposeful is the most common. It is not random, because if we're thinking about, we want to know something specific about a group of people who have been through some experience, right? So we need to be able to sample in a way that we catch those people. So it's not random. This is why we outline inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that means, you just want to identify in this section and describe what are the characteristics of those people that, they need to meet to participate in your study. So do they need to be above the age of 18? Do they need to be above the age of 30? Do they need to have worked in, with a particular company for 5 to 10 years, right? So all of those characteristics that people need to meet. And then you'll talk a little bit about how you plan to verify that prior to including them in your study. You also want to identify the number of participants that you are going to try to recruit. So this is usually given as a range in qualitative research. If you're conducting a case study, then it would be a good idea here to talk about, how many cases you'll be looking at. Then you want to outline the steps to identify your participants, how you're going to contact them or have them contact you, and how you plan to recruit them. So what I do recommend when you get to this point in the chapter is that you sort of bullet these out, and then, because you do want them to be, sort of steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. They need to flow logically, of course, but bullet them out and then go back and rewrite them into a narrative format. Okay. And you also want to talk about the size of the sample as it relates to data saturation. So the point at which, as you collect new data, you don't really learn anything new. And so, to do that, I recommend turning to the literature, both from your lit review chapter, but also, research and research methods that are kind of similar in topic to your own, to see what other scholars have used related to the sample. I would include another subheading here for the instrumentation. So for every data collection instrument you're using, and as I said, if it's a phenomenological study, you may just have an interview protocol, and that's okay. But if you're conducting a case study where you are perhaps conducting observations and interviews, you need to describe each of those instruments. So you would likely have an observation sheet and an interview protocol. You want to identify, is this something that's already published, or are you going to create your own? Okay. If you are conducting any kind of document review, you want to establish how you will identify the source material and how you will verify that it's accurate. Okay. And then for each of these data sources, then with the instruments, you want to demonstrate how those will address your research questions. So sometimes I think it's helpful here to set up a table that shows the alignment. So for each research question that you have, and hopefully it's not too many, but for, write out in a separate row in a table each research question, and then go through and fill it in. Okay, so to address this research question, then I need to interview people, and I need to interview these specific people, right, to show that alignment. So this is just a more about, in terms of the procedures for recruitment, participation, and data collection. So referring back to the instrumentation, you want to describe where you will collect data, who you will collect data from, the frequency and duration of data collection events, how you plan to record the data, and of course, if you are audio or video recording, and definitely include something in here about ensuring that you have permission, which is not, it's different from informed consent. Okay, that's a separate thing for participation in the study, but making sure that you have their permission to audio record. And then it's a good idea to include any contingency plans. There's almost always some loss to attrition, and so to ensure that you have the sample that you are aiming for, you want to talk about what happens when a couple people drop out. Okay, how you plan to recruit more people. You'll also describe any debriefing procedures or follow-up procedures in this section. Okay, so if you plan to have those interviews transcribed, and then you send a copy of the transcript to your participants so that they can verify its accuracy, then you would want to outline it in this section. So, and again, another, sort of subheading here for procedures for recruitment, participation, and data collection. Another subheading for your data analysis plan. So for each type of data, so again, if you're conducting interviews, or if you are conducting observations, if you are collecting documents for document analysis, you want to, again, identify how the data are connected to the research. So how those data will help you address your research questions. You want to walk through the coding procedures for your data. Okay, so how you plan to analyze it. If you plan to use any software for analysis, you want to talk about that here. And then how you plan to handle any discrepant cases in the data analysis. And these are the cases where, you might have 12 participants who sort of describe the same experience in the same way. And then you have another participant who had a very different experience. Okay, and that's common, that's normal. We all experience things differently, but we can't just toss that person aside just because it doesn't fit the pattern. So how do we handle that in the data analysis? You know, and I mean, kind of the helpful hint here is it tells you something different. It tells you something new. It points you in a new direction. It shows that there's variation to experience. You want to include a section on trustworthiness. So these are kind of the four key tenets of trustworthiness that we talk about, that we hear a lot about in qualitative research. So credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So, you know, sort of how confident we are that our findings are accurate. Are they applicable to findings in other contexts if they were applied to other contexts? Are they consistent? You know, can they be replicated with any degree of consistency? And are our findings based on our participants and not ourselves, right? And sort of what we think about things. And there are different ways to establish each of these four. So this slide kind of makes it look like they are mutually exclusive. So, you know, that, for example, triangulation is only helpful to establish credibility, and that's not the case. So these are kind of mix and match. But when you're writing this section, I would recommend, you know, one little paragraph for credibility, just describe what it is and how you plan to establish it, and do the same for each of these four things. So this is where you know, describe how you will establish each of those. And then in your ethical procedures, you want to outline all of the agreements to gain access to your research site, to your participants. So, you know, if it's IRB from your school, institutional review board from your school, outline that. It may be, you know, depending on your own research, it might be the case that, you know, you're working with an organization that has their own institutional review board. And so maybe you have to, you know, gain approval from both. Any site permissions that you need. Outline, you know, it's essentially, we're working with humans, how are we going to keep them safe? How are we going to treat them ethically? So any permissions that you need, any ethical considerations related to recruitment, you know, how do you plan to maintain their confidentiality through the recruitment process, through the data collection process, and then treatment of data. So it's sort of the two parts, right? The treatment of human participants and then the treatment of data. So in terms of treatment of data, just a clarification here in terms of anonymity versus confidentiality. Confidentiality is what we're going for in qualitative research. It's unlikely that our participants are entirely anonymous to us. Okay, that would be if you have no idea who they are at all. And that's probably not the case, because that's usually not how qualitative research works. So we want to keep the human participants and their data confidential. And this means, how are you going to secure your data so that nobody knows who your participants are and nobody can read their data? Okay, so how you will secure the data and how you plan to destroy it after a certain period of time. Most schools, you know, a time frame after which you can destroy the data. Oftentimes it's 5 years. That's not always the case though. So definitely check with your school on that one. The other thing that I would say about this section is that the more detail you can get into here in your methods chapter, the easier your IRB process is going to be, because you already have this written. What goes into this chapter is what goes into your IRB application for approval. Okay, so if you can think through all of this now as you're writing this chapter, then the IRB process becomes easier. If we go back to this idea of looking backward, looking forward, in the summary, you want to recap the highlights of the chapter. And again, think about pulling the reader along. So all research starts with the problem, moves to the purpose, the research questions, the method and methodology. Okay, that's how this flows. So recap the highlights. If someone were to come along and only read the summary, what do they need to know to understand the context to be able to move to the next chapter? Okay. And then you present a transition to the next chapter. So you've looked backward and you've looked forward in the transition. Now, that's all well and good, and I understand that. Some of you may be here though, because it's not so much a what goes into the chapter and a little bit more of a how do I even get started kind of question or situation that you find yourselves in. I see a lot of people get really stuck on the methods chapter. For one, it's maybe the first time you've conducted qualitative research, and maybe that makes you uncomfortable. Maybe you feel like you should know how to do it. And that's not the case because you're writing a dissertation and that is the learning process. So I understand that this chapter can be daunting. That is perfectly fine. Don't let it be. Don't let this be the place where you just spin your wheels and you don't get past. Okay, you can absolutely do this. Start with your problem, start with your purpose, start with your research questions, and just brainstorm. What data do you need to answer all of this? Who are the people that you need to talk to? Just start broadly sketching all of this out. What documents might give you the answers to your research questions that help you to address the problem? You know, are there observations that might give you the answers? Okay, so start with the brainstorming. Okay, think of this as a recipe, right? Your reader, in order to be replicable, your reader has to be able to follow everything that you have outlined in this chapter so that they can do it, you know, apply it in a different context. So I think of this in terms of ingredients and instructions. Your methods are your ingredients. The methodology is the instructions, okay? If you're making chocolate chip cookies, which are delicious, you have to have the ingredients and the instructions, right? Because you can have the list of ingredients, how many chocolate chips need to go in there, how much flour, you know, how much sugar and all of that. But unless you have the instructions, you don't know what to do with all of that. Likewise, if you just have the instructions, okay, you don't know how, you might know the order of operations for making chocolate chip cookies, but you don't know how much needs to go in there. So thinking about it like that and kind of breaking it down into ingredients and instructions, I think can be really helpful. This chapter is the expectation. You are proposing to conduct research, but you haven't conducted it yet. So things are going to change. It will probably not be what happens exactly in the end. For the last 2 years, I don't think anybody's dissertations have changed or have turned out the way they thought they were going to. Okay, so the other where I see people really spin their wheels is worrying about the what ifs. You know, what if I am unable to collect data in this way? What if something happens? What if I don't recruit enough people? Well, you know what? Don't worry about that. Write it up as though everything is going to go according to plan. In an ideal world, this is exactly how everything works. Okay. In your results chapter, you can outline when and where and how things change, if anything. Okay. And perhaps they changed and presented a limitation to your research. Okay. And if that's the case, then you handle that in the discussion chapter. That is totally fine. But I see people getting stuck where they go, well, I don't know if this is exactly how it's going to go. And it doesn't matter. Do the best that you can. You know, think about backup plans, contingencies, of course. Like I said, there's always going to be loss to attrition. You know, you're probably going to struggle with recruitment because that's sort of always a challenge in qualitative research and in quantitative research. You know, those things are to be expected. So expect some of the unexpected, be okay with that, and know that it is not the end of the world if things change, and that you have the opportunity to handle and talk about all of that later. If you're still stuck, that is exactly where we come in. Okay, so like I said, we are Statistics Solutions. We're a full service dissertation consulting company. We are here to help you with editorial support for your dissertations. So we have research mentors on staff. We have qualitative and quantitative mentors on staff. And we provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation so that we can get to know you and your project better, right? So that we can figure out how we can come in and assist. As I said, we provide support from topic development all the way through until the final dissertation defense. So you can give us a call, you can email us. You can also check out our website, statisticssolutions.com. Through the website, you can self-schedule for a complimentary consultation call so we can talk about the support that we can provide you. We also have a ton of free goodies related to everything dissertation related. So we have a blog on the website. We have our schedule of upcoming webinars. So if you're here, but you're thinking you don't want to conduct a qualitative study, maybe now you're thinking about quantitative study, we have quantitative webinars coming up. Maybe you're at your discussion chapter. We've got webinars for that as well. And you can also take a look at our archived webinars. So the webinars that we've already run. So a lot of really great free resources available for you on our website. So we do have time for Q&A at this point. Go ahead and drop any questions that you have into the question and answer box so that I can read those out loud for everybody and make sure that everybody hears the answer. And so a question about, are we allowed to change methodology along the line when we think we're unable to collect our dream data? The answer is yes. Okay. And it might be painful, it might hurt, it might be uncomfortable when you realize that things aren't going to plan. And it's always a good idea to try a couple of times, make sure it's truly not going to work out. But look, you're paying money to be in school. You don't want it to take forever. So if you need to change things, yes, it is totally fine. So you may have to go back and tweak your methods chapter. Sometimes it means a revision to your IRB, and maybe you have to submit an amendment to your IRB to make sure that what you're doing that's new is okay. But yes, these things happen. Think about everybody who thought they were going to conduct face-to-face interviews in early 2000 and then realized a couple of months later that wasn't going to happen, and immediately had to change. Okay.
Rachel, there's another question that someone asked. If you look at the answered, and I submitted it to you through the chat as well.
Got it. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. So for case study research, is it preferable to keep participants anonymous? No, I think it's almost impossible. I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible because I don't want to, say like 100%, but I don't, you want to maintain their confidentiality, right? You want to keep their data under lock and key so that nobody knows who your participants are. You want to keep any identifying information confidential. But if you're conducting a case study and you are interviewing people, you know who they are. Okay, so I would say always strive for confidentiality, but the anonymity is going to be very, very hard. We do have time for other questions if there are more. Don't see anything coming through. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you all so much for hanging out with me this afternoon, or perhaps it's morning or evening where you all are. I appreciated the discussion. Best of luck to all of you. Please take advantage of what we have to offer on the website, and schedule your complimentary consultation so that we can figure out how we can best assist you. Happy writing. Good luck. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.